Hey guys, how you doing? So welcome to chapter 3, energy transformations. And in this chapter, we're going to take a look at two key energy processes, that is photosynthesis and respiration. One of which you probably have been learning quite a bit about over the years, and the other one probably you're not so familiar with, but we're going to have a look at it. We're going to break this video into two main parts, one looking at photosynthesis and then one looking at respiration. And in this video, we're going to cap on photosynthesis. Okay, let's jump into it. Okay, chapter 3, energy transformations. Basically, we're going to go over kind of the first 6 today, and the first 7 today, and then cellular respiration, the last one, which is actually even longer, we're going to cover in the next video. Okay, now requirements for life. So basic requirements for all living things are kind of broken down into a few key factors. Okay, the first is access to energy from the environment. All organisms, in order to survive, need energy, and they get that energy from their surrounding environment in various different ways. Okay, whether that be sunlight, chemical, heat, or whatever. Each one is different according to sort of the species and the kingdom. Okay. The second one, they have to obtain organic molecules. They have to have some sort of building block in order to construct their cells. We kind of call that food, but really what we're talking about there is nutrients. Nutrients being essential organic molecules that are essential for the building blocks of life. Followed by exchanging gases with the environment. The gas plays a really important role, and you are going to find out why later on in this chapter. For animals, we need oxygen to go into our cells, and we need carbon dioxide to leave our cells. For plants, they also need oxygen into their cells, but the net result is that they produce more oxygen out of the cell than in, and they need carbon dioxide in order to photosynthesize. Okay. And the last one is we need to be able to remove waste products. Okay, so those are the basic requirements that all organisms need in order to survive. And so we're going to take a look at how organisms actually get those energy. Okay, so in terms of external sources of energy, where do they get their energy? Let's have a look at a few examples. Now, this is the mountain ash. If you drive through the Black Spurs on the way to Marysville, you'll see these trees a lot. Have a think about where a mountain ash tree, a gum tree, a type of gum tree, would be able to find or get its energy from. Same with a green alga. This is sea lettuce, which you normally see along the coastal intertidal zone area all around Victoria. This is the bracket fungus found on trees and logs, and often in kind of particularly moist environments. You'll see that fungus kind of grow. And this is the copperhead snake. If we had to consider each one of these organisms, they all belong to a different major category. Yeah, you've got your plants, you've got your protists, you've got your fungus, and then you've got your animals. And they all need to get their energy from the environment. And they do that in various ways, right? The two major external sources of energy that can be captured by organisms are actually really only radiant energy and chemical energy. But you can sort of see that in our world, there are more than just this. There's thermal energy, electrical, kinetic, radiant, chemical, etc. But the two main ones that organisms can actually obtain are the radiant and the chemical energy. Okay, so if we had to break it up, organisms that obtain their energy from the sun, that is radiant energy, are called autotrophs. Yeah, and so auto meaning kind of self, and then trophic or trophus kind of meaning food. Yeah. So it's like a self-feed way of thinking about it. Okay. Now that is called photosynthesis when it comes from the sun. Photo for sunlight, and synthesis is to produce. And the two main categories of organisms that can do that are your plants and your algae. All right, they are the major autotrophs on our planet today. And plants have to transform that radiant energy into chemical energy. Okay. Using inorganic substances and with the help of the sun. And algae are also the same, and bacteria. Okay. Now the second one, the ones that organisms that capture energy or chemical energy are called heterotrophs. Yeah, and they do that through a process called cellular respiration. And animals and fungus and some type of protists will do that. Okay, so heterotrophs don't need to convert the chemical energy, but they simply break it back down into its basic inorganic parts. Okay. Now, let's take a look at radiant energy. Radiant energy is captured through plants through a type of pigment called chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is what makes the plant green, and it is a light capturing pigment that is found in plants. Yeah, they are found in specialized organelles inside the plants called the chloroplasts, which you have learnt about in the previous chapter. And the different types of chlorophyll will capture different colors of light among the spectrum, which is why you get plants of still varying degrees of colors, because they have pigments inside of them that capture different spectrums of light different colors of light in the spectrum. Okay, so the most popular one that you probably are most well known of are the green chlorophyll pigments, which reject only the green colors and absorb every other color, which is why they appear green, and the majority of plants appear green. And so you can sort of see in this particular image here, visible light forms a very small section of the electromagnetic spectrum, and it spans from ultraviolet all the way to red, and the visible greens are the ones in the middle that are not absorbed by the plants, and then they mainly absorb in the areas of red and the ultraviolet blues. Okay, and so those plants will appear green, right? Red chlorophyll pigments, however, will do the opposite, and they will absorb in the red one, like for example this one here, right? And then they will reject the other colors, and so therefore they might appear the color red because it rejects the color red or the color violet or something like that. Okay. Here's a table showing the different types of pigments and then their absorption peaks. Now the key thing for you guys to note here is that you've got varying types of chlorophyll pigments, and you can imagine in terms of adaptation and survival, that's really important because, for example, when sunlight goes through water, a lot of the colors at a lower spectrum like your reds are immediately removed. And so what actually happens, your high colored powers like ultraviolet all the way down to greens are immediately removed, and so red is being kind of really important there as well. And so plants need to be able to vary their absorption peaks so that they can make the most of all of the different colors within sunlight. Okay, so that's what this kind of slide is mainly looking at here. Okay. Now the process of photosynthesis, let me reiterate, but this time in a little bit more detail in terms of the chemical reaction of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is defined by the production of glucose and oxygen from carbon dioxide and water. You can see this is a lot more of a chemical definition rather than just saying the method in which plants get their food, right? Because we're being very specific, glucose being the product and oxygen being the byproduct, and carbon dioxide and water being the main reactants or constituents that they need, the ingredients, okay? And so the process of photosynthesis transforms radiant energy into chemical energy. And so it's assisted by the chlorophyll pigment found inside the chloroplast, which is found inside the cells of plants as an organelle, right? Here you would have seen this, this formula for quite a while now, carbon dioxide and water with the addition of light and assisted by chlorophyll will produce glucose, oxygen, and you can sort of see here in this definition it creates an extra amount of water. I'll explain why in just a second, but those are your products. Here is a diagram of the chloroplast organelle, and you can see there that it's made up of these layers or these stacks called the granum or grana, and then the fluid in between them are called the stroma, and it's what allows them to absorb the sunlight and convert that sunlight into chemical energy. Okay, now here is the chemical formula, yeah, that there are 6 molecules specifically of carbon dioxide with 12 molecules of water with the assistance of chlorophyll and light will form 1 molecule of glucose, 6 molecules of oxygen, and then another 6 molecules of water. So you can see there that there is a surplus of water on both the product side and the reactant side. And so what that means is that if you simplify the diagram and you remove the 6 molecules of water, you end up with 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O, gives you 1 C2H12O6 glucose and 6 oxygen O2. Okay, what this means is that for photosynthesis to occur, the plant actually needs to start with 12 molecules of the water, and it uses that water to kind of jumpstart the system, and then it produces a remaining 6 molecules of water, which is then recycled and reused by the plant. Okay, and so that's why it's not really included, that extra 6 is not really included in the formula. But this down here is what you need to memorize and know. Okay, all right. I'll jump the video. Now, in order to achieve photosynthesis, plants then need a few key ingredients. The first thing that they need is water, and they obtain that from the soil for terrestrial plants and from the water body for aquatic plants, okay? They also need sunlight, so access to sunlight is really crucial to drive the process. Carbon dioxide from the air or diffused inside the water for aquatic plants, and those are your three key ingredients. A plant will need water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide in order to photosynthesize. Now, they are not the only thing that a plant needs. Plants will also need minerals and things like that from the soil, from fertilizers and things like that. However, in this particular case, to drive the process of photosynthesis, which is what allows the plant to obtain glucose and therefore create its own energy source, those are the three key ingredients, okay? And the products is glucose, which is then used and transported around the plants and then also converted into complex molecules, which I will talk to you guys about later, and oxygen, which is actually a byproduct or a waste product that's released back into the air. The plant will use some amounts of its own oxygen, but when photosynthesis is really high, the surplus of oxygen gets dumped and released as a waste product, okay? Here's a very simple diagram to show what happens. Water from the soil. Here's a typical terrestrial plant. Water is obtained from the soil, absorbed by the roots. And then you've got the leaf, which is your main photosynthetic organ. It's your the main structure that the plant uses to drive photosynthesis. It captures sunlight through chlorophyll. It takes carbon dioxide through the stomata, and then it produces glucose within the leaf, which then gets transported and releases oxygen into the atmosphere. Okay. Here's a brief diagram that you will kind of see notice in your textbook. The main key thing, once again, is understanding what ingredients are going into the plant and what's coming out of the plant. You've got three major gases that are either moving in or out of the plant, okay? H2O needs to go into the chloroplast. Carbon dioxide also needs to go into the chloroplast, and the process will produce your glucose, which then gets transported out of the cell, and it will also produce another gas, oxygen, which then gets released into the air, okay? So oxygen is actually going out, whereas carbon dioxide and water is going in, okay? Now, I'm going to take a bit of a sidestep, and you'll notice that often one of the kind of key questions a lot of people have about the process of photosynthesis, and in particular in plants, that you'll notice that during the autumn, leaves will often change color, right? And so, it happens mainly in your deciduous plants, which are plants that dump their leaves during winter and then will regrow them again during the spring. And those plants are usually plants that live in areas where the leaves might struggle with frost and cold, for example. And so because they're fragile, they need to be dumped. And so what the plant does is on the onset, during autumn, before winter occurs, it will reabsorb all the nutrients from the leaves and store them within the plant during the winter. And during that process, what happens is the photosynthesis process kind of ceased, and the plant kind of goes into hibernation, okay? What that also means is the leaf will no longer produce any chlorophyll pigment that's green. And so what happens is the carotenoids, which is another type of pigment within the plant, becomes revealed because the green pigments are now being reabsorbed by the plant, and eventually the leaves will fall off, okay? Now in Australia, we don't really get that because one, we don't really get a lot of snow in the whole country, and also what that means is that plants don't have a need to kind of constantly replenish their leaves because of snow or frost damage. And also too, our soils are really poor, so we don't have a lot of nutrients in Australia. The soil doesn't have a lot of nutrients for plants to have the luxury of regrowing their entire canopy of leaves every year. And so we have a different method called evergreen plants who stay green all year round. And so they maintain their greenness, but they look for different ways to adapt to the Australian climate, okay? Now, back into the main topic. In terms of photosynthesis, when you look at the structure of a plant, it is designed to maximize that process of photosynthesis, okay? If we look at our main ingredients and products, you can see there that the plant can be broken up into three main components. You've got your roots down the bottom, you've got your stem, and then you've got your leaf, okay? Now, in terms of sunlight will enter or get captured through the leaf, which is why they're green. Water, however, does not get absorbed through the leaf. It actually enters through the roots and it travels up the plants to the leaves. And so it is absorbed within the root, and the roots actually have, the root cells will have an extension called root hairs to maximize their surface area so they can absorb as much water and minerals that's dissolved in the water from the ground as possible. And so these root hairs, you can sort of see there, here's a few radish seeds, and those little kind of fluffy stuff is actually the root hairs, which is designed to absorb as much water as possible from the roots up into the cell towards the stem, and the water always moves from the roots up towards the canopy, towards the leaves, right? And the reason why it does that is because it has a particular process which we'll look at in the next chapter called transpiration that allows it to do that. But for the time being, water goes up from the roots, not at the leaves, okay? Which is also when you water plants, there's no point watering them at the leaves because the water actually doesn't do anything at the leaves other than keeping it slightly moist. What you really should be doing is actually water the roots, and then what happens is they will absorb the water and bring it up towards the leaves. Okay, carbon dioxide also goes into the leaves as well, and oxygen will exit through the stomata of the leaf. Okay, and so what you've got here is your leaf is your main photosynthetic organ. Everything else kind of funnels resources to the leaves. Okay, your stem will contain your vascular bundle, and these vascular bundles are kind of like vessels that allows the plant to transport material throughout the different areas of the plant, through the different branches and leaves and roots and things like that. Okay, so they have two components: your phloem and your phloem and your xylem, which we'll talk about later in the next chapter. And then those things transport things towards your kind of nutrients and gases throughout your plant. And at the leaves, if I take a cross section of my leaf and then I peer into the cross section, I'm going to see something that looks like this, and under a microscope I'm going to see this kind of structure in terms of terrestrial plants. So you'll notice a few key areas of the plants. You've got your kind of your cuticle, which is the outer layer, the epidermis, which is kind of like your skin, and then you've got loads and loads of chloroplasts, and those are the main pigments, the main organelles which allows the plant to photosynthesize. There is also some transport vessels in the center of the leaf, and see this little organelle here, this little structure here in the leaf, that is the stoma or the stomata, and that is your main area in which the plant will take in its carbon dioxide, take and release its oxygen, and also the water that moves up the leaf will also exit through the stoma as well. So the plants in most cases will actually lose water during the process of photosynthesis, as well as use up water. Okay, here is a microscope slide showing the stomata. Now you guys probably have seen this many times throughout the years learning about plants, but that particular structure is very important in plants. Okay, so the roots tap into the soil, they absorb water and minerals, and you'll notice once again the concept of surface area to volume ratio being really important here. The root hairs will increase surface area to maximize the amount of absorption that the plant has for its exposure. Okay, the stems will then move it up the leaf, and also any glucose that the leaf produces will then be taken and transported down the leaf towards other areas, because remember, the leaves produce the glucose, but they need to send it to the other parts of the plant that cannot produce the glucose, such as the roots, because they are underground. They cannot photosynthesize because they are underground, and so they need a source of glucose and nutrients as well. And also the stem or the trunk will provide structural support like branches and things like that. Okay, the leaves are often flat and wide, once again to also maximize surface area, to absorb as much sunlight as possible to maximize the process of photosynthesis. Okay, they've contain your photosynthetic cells, which is full of chloroplasts, and they also contain stomata for gas exchange. Yeah, and so that process of taking in the carbon dioxide and then releasing the oxygen, and also releasing any excess water from the roots of the plant is called gas exchange. Okay, here is a microscope slide. An scanning electron image of the cross section of a leaf, and you can see the actual structures of each of the cells and things like that. in quite good detail. Okay. Now, the next process, this one's probably less known, and it is called chemosynthesis. Now, chemosynthesis is the production of glucose from chemical energy of inorganic chemicals. So rather than using sunlight, what it actually uses is it uses the chemical energy within inorganic chemicals such as sulfur and things like that in order to actually produce glucose. Yeah, and this happens mainly in some locations such as the bottom of ocean trenches where there's no sunlight to allow photosynthesis. So the organisms that live down there, however, such as bacteria, will use a different process such as chemosynthesis to produce inorganic compounds. And so if down the bottom of your ocean trenches, there are these things called hydrothermal vents, and what they do is they spew out sulfur and other chemicals and things like that. And the bacteria that live there will actually use that and take advantage of that and produce their own glucose from that. And then what happens is you get other organisms such as tube worms, shrimps, and crustaceans actually feeding off the bacteria and the plankton as the food source, and that forms a different type of food chain altogether. Okay. Alright, so we're going to leave it there. Next lesson, we're going to have a look at the process of cellular respiration, which is in greater detail. But hopefully you guys have learned something and you enjoyed the video. Okay, see ya.